2 weeks after young officers ousted Burkina Faso's transitional president in the country's second coup in less than 9 months, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was sworn in as president.
Despite international condemnation, a show of support at the nation's Independence Square for Mali's military junta leader Assimi Goïta. They hold signs saying, "Down with France." Others wave Russian flags, hoping for Moscow's military support.
These chaotic scenes outside the French embassy are certain to deepen concern in the West. Supporters of the coup, which has been boosted by anti-French sentiment, lit fires and shouted their support for Vladimir Putin as they waved the Russian tricolor.
Hey, Breakdown family. Soldiers marching on TV. Flags being lowered. A general in dark sunglasses declaring, "In the interest of national stability." If you've lived in Africa long enough, you know the pattern. And recently, it's starting to feel like deja vu. From Mali to Burkina Faso, Guinea to Niger, Chad to Gabon, the coups are back. But this time, something feels different. In the past, military takeovers were met with fear, condemnation, and calls for a return to civilian rule. But today, we're seeing something else: applause. Instead of protest against military rule, we're seeing protest for it. People pouring into the streets, waving flags, chanting slogans, cheering the end of democracy like it's a World Cup final. Something is shifting, not just in 1 or 2 countries, but across an entire region, and maybe even a continent. So today on The Breakdown, we're asking, is democracy failing Africa? Or is it that it was really never real to begin with? Is the problem the system itself? Or is it something deeper, rooted in colonial legacies, foreign influence, and a growing hunger for sovereignty? Because this isn't just about coups. It's about control. It's about legitimacy. It's about the future of African governance and who gets to shape it. And trust me, this one's going to challenge you. But before we dive in, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Because just a couple of months after launching this show, we've already crossed 100,000 subscribers. That is incredible. And to everyone who subscribed, dropped a super thanks, shared our videos, or joined our membership, thank you so much, truly, from the bottom of my heart. I've read your comments, learned from your insights, and have been deeply moved by your passion, your love for the continent, and your desire to just see a better, more just, more equitable world. You make me hopeful for the future. And I want to give a special shout out to a few of our core VIP members who recently joined. Therian Thomas, Brother Dale, Ensley Townsend, we see you. We appreciate you. Welcome to the family. And if you haven't joined our membership community yet, this is your invitation. Click the join button. Don't just be a part of the conversation, be a part of the solution as well. I'd love to connect with you there. All right, now let's get into it.
Another African leader toppled by the army. Whose turn will it be next? The fall of Gabon's leader, Ali Bongo, has rattled the continent's autocrats and democrats alike. Cameroon and Rwanda both made hurried changes to their top military within hours of the coup in Libreville. And they have good reason to be nervous. Since World War II, 45 of the continent's 54 countries have suffered attempted coups, and military takeovers are on the rise again now.
So let's start with the facts. Since 2020, Africa has seen a sharp resurgence of military takeovers, both successful and attempted. And this isn't isolated. It's become a continental trend, particularly concentrated in West and Central Africa. Here's a quick timeline. Mali, 2020 and 2021. First, soldiers led by Colonel Assimi Goïta overthrew President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. Now, less than a year later, they staged a second coup, this time removing the transitional president and consolidating power. Guinea, 2021. Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya overthrew Alpha Condé after Condé changed the constitution to give himself a third term. Doumbouya marched through the capital with soldiers and declared a new era. Then you had Sudan, 2021. Military leaders dissolved the power-sharing transitional government, plunging the country back into unrest just 2 years after the fall of Omar al-Bashir. Burkina Faso, 2022. In less than a year, 2 coups. First, Paul-Henri Damiba took over. Then 34-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré led a second coup, citing worsening insecurity. Niger, 2023. President Mohamed Bazoum was overthrown by General Abdurrahmani Chani. Niger, once seen as a key Western ally, pivoted toward French military regimes and expelled French troops. Gabon, 2023. The Bongo dynasty came to an end when military officers seized power just after presidential election results were announced, claiming electoral fraud and institutional decay. Democratic Republic of Congo, 2024. An attempted coup was thwarted in Kinshasa, linked to disgruntled former officers. Though unsuccessful, it highlighted how fragile the region remains. Burkina Faso, again, 2025. Just this April, the government reported another attempted coup, this time against Traoré himself, allegedly involving actors linked to neighboring Côte d'Ivoire and possibly foreign backers. That's at least 7 countries, 9 actual coups, and multiple attempted takeovers in just 5 years. What we're seeing is not random. It's a pattern. And it raises a question we can't ignore. What is it about the current state of governance that makes military intervention seem, at least to some, like a viable or even necessary solution?
You've published fascinating research into all coups worldwide, going back to 1945, and Africa, as you've observed, is the global epicenter of coups. Don't you want to just start by telling us more about your main findings, Professor?
Yeah, well, the first thing, important finding is that not all coups are the same. So when we talk about there being a resurgence of coups in Africa, there's actually been multiple resurgences because we can distinguish between, on the one hand, for example, regime change coups that seek to, say, overthrow democratically elected government, as recently happened in Niger, or leader reshuffling coups that, in fact, are trying to preserve the incumbent regime, like we saw in Chad just a few years ago, to try to have the Deby regime continue in power. So there's a lot of variety of coups, and that actually makes it particularly difficult to gain traction to say in general about what are the causes, for example, of the recent coup wave in Africa. But that is, in fact, what we try to do.
Now, to understand why military takeovers are making a comeback, and in some cases, even being welcomed, we need to rewind the clock. Because this didn't start in 2020. After independence in the 1960s, many African nations began their journey toward self-rule with immense hope. But almost immediately, they were handed a paradox: Western-style democracy on top of deeply colonial foundations, borders drawn by outsiders, institutions designed to control, not empower, economies built to extract, not develop. And into that system, we dropped multi-party elections and called it democracy. But the form rarely matched the function. For decades, what we saw instead was a cycle of one-party dominance under leaders who refused to step down, foreign-backed regimes propped up to serve Cold War interests, coups replacing coups, often not to restore democracy, but to seize control. By the 1990s and early 2000s, many countries had embraced electoral politics again, backed by international donors and organizations. There was optimism. Presidents were being elected. Term limits were in place. The world called it a democratic wave. But for many ordinary people, little changed. Government corruption remained high. Basic services, education, electricity, clean water remained scarce. And insecurity, especially from extremist violence in the Sahel, only grew worse. Over time, people started asking, what's the point of elections if nothing actually changes? What's the point of voting if the same elites keep benefiting while the people keep struggling? And when trust in democratic institutions erodes, when courts don't deliver justice, parliaments don't represent the people, and elections are riddled with fraud, that's when people start looking elsewhere. And in today's context, that elsewhere is increasingly the military. Not necessarily because they believe in authoritarianism, but because they've given up on democracy that never delivered. And this is the crisis at the heart of it all. Africa didn't just inherit colonial borders, it inherited a broken political blueprint. And now that blueprint is being questioned, country by country.
From 2020 to 2022, there were 11 coup attempts. Now add 2, Niger and Gabon. That takes us to 13. What would you say has sparked this resurgence of coups, I think, as you called it?
Well, the first thing we looked at was, did it have something to do with the global COVID pandemic? Because the wave really started to take off around 2020 at the same time as the pandemic. And it turns out we didn't really find much, if any, evidence of that. In fact, it's some of the more traditional suspects that we think are most closely associated with the resurgence. So again, poverty, dilemmas of democratic development. Of course, in the various cases in West Africa, which have been the majority of cases, prominent Islamist insurgencies have also played an important role.
Now let's take a closer look at some of the countries leading this wave of military takeovers. Because while the headlines may sound the same, each story reveals something unique about why people are rejecting the old system and what they're hoping military leadership might fix. Let's start with Mali. In 2020, Colonel Assimi Goïta led a coup against President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta after mass protests over corruption and a failure to stop jihadist violence. Now, less than a year later, Goïta staged a second coup, this time against the transitional government he helped create. Instead of outrage, he was met with popular support. He's since expelled French troops, aligned with Russia, and helped form the Alliance of Sahel states with Niger and Burkina Faso. And just this year, a national dialogue, boycotted by most political parties, by the way, recommended that he stay in power for 5 more years. No election, no public vote, but no mass protest either. Now let's turn to Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso saw 2 coups in 2022. First, Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba took power, but when he failed to stop escalating terrorist attacks, Captain Ibrahim Traoré overthrew him months later. At just 34 years old, Traoré became the face of a new kind of military leadership. He was young, defiant, Pan-African, and fiercely nationalistic. He suspended elections, rejected Western criticism, and drawn massive public rallies in his favor. And despite an attempted coup against him in April 2025, thousands came out to defend him, not the idea of democracy, but the man they believe is fighting for their future. Now to Niger. In 2023, General Abdourahmane Chani seized power from President Mohamed Bazoum, one of the West's last allies in the region. Chani accused Bazoum of failing to protect the nation from insecurity. He immediately cut ties with France, expelled U.S. troops from a key drone base, and joined the Alliance of Sahel States. But unlike Mali and Burkina Faso, Niger was more economically stable, and the coup shook foreign governments. Yet, many Nigerians saw it as a sovereign stand against foreign control. Then let's look at Gabon. In 2023, the Bongo family's decade-long rule ended when military officers seized power shortly after President Ali Bongo was declared re-elected under suspicious circumstances. Unlike the Sahel, this wasn't about terrorism or foreign troops. It was about electoral legitimacy. The coup was swift and widely supported by Gabonese citizens who were fed up with the dynasty and its grip on power. So what do these coups tell us? They're not all the same. Some are rooted in security failure, others in corruption, elite domination, or foreign interference. But they all share one thing: a rejection of the status quo. And a public so frustrated with democracy as theater that they're willing to try something else. Whether that something else works, well, that's still to be seen.
And how much of a role have outside influences played? France and Russia, the role that they are playing in some of these countries. Do they have a part to play, or is it solely local factors?
Well, outside actors have a role to play. I don't think they really had much of a causal role sort of triggering the recent coup resurgence. There have been, reports that of the Wagner Group, being an important actor in some of these countries. Of course, France and the United States have also been active with military training and so on to oppose the Islamist insurgencies across the Sahel. But I don't think it's any of the outside actors who are quote unquote to blame. I do think that it is largely local and regional dynamics that are at play here.
Let's talk about something that's been surprising and to some unsettling. Why are so many civilians cheering these coups? In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, people didn't just accept military takeovers. They celebrated them. Crowds filled the streets. Flags were raised. Military leaders were praised as liberators. So what's going on? The answer lies in something deeper than just politics. This is about trust and the fact that in many countries, that trust in democracy is already gone. Here's why. One, elections haven't changed lives. Yes, many African countries hold elections, but what comes after? The same faces, the same broken promises, the same roads with potholes, the same schools without teachers, the same hospitals without medicine. For millions of people, democracy hasn't delivered development. So the question becomes, what's the point of voting if nothing ever changes? And two, corruption is still rampant. Democratically elected governments have not been immune to corruption. In some cases, they've become expert at it. Bribery, embezzlement, favoritism. These are not the exceptions, they are often the norm. So when a leader promises to clean house, people are willing to listen because they've already tried the ballot box and it didn't protect them from being robbed in broad daylight. And three, security is a daily struggle, right? In the Sahel, extremist violence has made daily life unlivable for many communities. Civilians have watched as democratically elected governments failed, sometimes catastrophically, to protect them from armed groups. So when a soldier says we're taking control to restore order, it doesn't sound like a threat. It sounds like a plan. 4, foreign influence breeds suspicion. There is also a growing feeling that many African democracies were never truly independent. They were heavily shaped, if not outright managed, by former colonial powers, foreign donors, and international institutions. And when those same foreign powers criticize military regimes while backing corrupt civilian ones, the people notice and they start to question who democracy was really serving. So when civilians cheer a coup, they're not necessarily cheering military rule. They're cheering the end of something that no longer made sense. They're cheering the hope, however fragile, that someone else might finally deliver results. But here's the danger. When military leaders become popular, it doesn't mean they're accountable. And when coups are celebrated, they become contagious. So the applause we're seeing today, it may be masking a deeper problem, a collapse of faith in democracy itself.
So, Professor, of the now 13 coups that we have seen in Africa since 2020, many of them have had public support. I'll point to Niger and to a large extent Gabon. I just wondered, of the ones that we've had before these two, what results have these military takeovers had? Have they delivered on their promise?
Well, not all of them made the same promises. But for those that did promise a quick return to elected constitutional democratic rule, those promises have largely gone unfulfilled. And although a number of military juntas in the region have made promises under pressure, threat of sanctions, or actually imposed sanctions from ECOWAS, the United States, France, and others, once sanctions are lifted, promises are often revoked. And so we haven't really seen a successful return to democracy in any of these countries.
Now let's ask a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Have African countries ever truly governed themselves independently on their own terms? Because while democracy has been the official model for decades, the reality on the ground tells a different story. One, the shadow of colonialism never left. Hey, let's be real. When African nations gained independence in the 1960s, they inherited more than borders. They inherited entire political and economic systems designed for extraction, not development. And most were never fully restructured. The former colonizers, France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium, left through the front door, but stayed through the back, through trade deals, through currency systems like the CFA franc, through military bases, debt obligations, and carefully crafted partnerships. In many cases, African governments were democratic in name while answering to outside interests in practice. 2, AIDS, loans, and the illusion of sovereignty. You know what's worse than not having sovereignty? The illusion that you do. Foreign aid, while framed as support, has often come with strings attached. Do this reform, cut that subsidy, open your markets, buy from these suppliers. Multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank have dictated the pace and direction of economic policy in many African countries, undermining democratic decision-making in the process. And when elections are funded by outside governments, when armies are trained by foreign militaries, when surveillance equipment is imported to monitor dissent, it raises a tough question. Are these African governments acting on behalf of their people, or are they managing external expectations to stay in power? 3, the hypocrisy of Western democracy promotion. Many citizens see a double standard. When an African election is rigged, but the winner is aligned with Western interests, no one says much. But when a military leader kicks out foreign troops or challenges old power structures, suddenly the global outrage is loud. That's why leaders like Goita, Traoré, and Chani are gaining traction, not just because they wear military uniforms, but because they speak the language of sovereignty. They're saying, we'll govern ourselves, we'll choose our partners, and we won't be lectured by those who never gave us real freedom to begin with. Now, whether they live up to that promise is a different story. We're watching. But the sentiment, it resonates deeply. So the question isn't just why is democracy failing? It's whose democracy was it in the first place? Until African nations have the full freedom to chart their own course, economically, politically, and culturally, then any model of governance will always be at risk of breaking down. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. Is it democracy that's failing, or the version Africa was given? So here's the question we've been circling around all episode. Is democracy really failing Africa? Or is it just the version Africa was given? Because democracy, real democracy, is about more than just elections. It's about accountability, justice, representation, trust, outcomes. But in many African countries, what was introduced or imposed was a hollow version of democracy. Elections without transparency, constitutions written to keep leaders in power, courts that serve the elite, parliaments that rubber stamp decisions instead of debating them, and a civil service more loyal to political parties than to the people. It sounded like democracy. It looked like democracy, but it rarely worked like democracy. Many African nations inherited Western-style systems that didn't align with their histories, cultures, or realities. In some cases, these systems were modeled on former colonial powers. In others, they were hastily assembled during transitions brokered by donors or international actors. But few were designed by Africans for Africans. The result? A mismatch, a system that might function on paper, but not in practice. When democracy becomes a process without progress, people stop believing in the process. If every election leads to the same suffering, if corruption goes unpunished, if security keeps worsening, if institutions are weak or co-opted, then people naturally start to ask, what are we actually voting for? And when the system feels foreign, unaccountable, and ineffective, military rule can start to look like the only available alternative. Not because it's ideal, but because it's different. So maybe the issue isn't democracy itself. Maybe it's the way democracy was delivered, externally shaped, poorly adapted, and hollowed out over time. And now we're watching that version of democracy collapse, not just in Mali, not just in Burkina Faso, but across a continent where people are hungry for something that actually works.
Could you talk us through what you mean by the phrase coup contagion?
Unfortunately, I do think that we're going to continue to see coup activity in Africa. Scholars of coups, when we talk about coup contagion, we are really thinking of coups almost like a virus, how they might spread from one patient to another or victim to another. And the question is coup activity in one country influencing or making coup activity in another country more likely? And it's actually very difficult to say how the extent to which that is the case in the recent coup wave. There is circumstantial evidence of coup contagion. We know, for example, that some of the coup plotters have trained together in Paris, for example, and so that there are some personal connections between some of the coup leaders. But there's definitely no smoking gun evidence, and so in the absence of that, one might have to assume that local domestic factors will still be the dominant one in coup activity moving forward.
Now, before we talk about what could come next for Africa, let's look at what's already taken place. Because Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the three countries at the heart of this coup wave, aren't just breaking away from the old order. They're trying to build something new. It's called the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. And it's more than just a military alliance. It's a political statement. Formed in 2023, the Alliance of Sahel States brings together the military-led governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. After being suspended from ECOWAS and facing sanctions from the West, these countries withdrew and announced the AES as an alternative, a pact focused on mutual defense, sovereignty, and self-determination. They've expelled foreign military bases, particularly French troops, strengthened ties with Russia, the UAE, and Turkey, rejected ECOWAS timelines for returning to democracy, and have proposed joint infrastructure, security coordination, and economic integration. This isn't just geopolitics. It's a clear rejection of what they see as a failed regional system and foreign-imposed governance. AES leaders have made it clear they are not anti-democracy. They say they're anti-hypocrisy. They argue that democracies they overthrew were corrupt and ineffective. ECOWAS, instead of defending people, defended elite and foreign interests. Western-backed governments often ignored insecurity and development. Their goal is to restore sovereignty, protect their people, and build new systems on their own terms. Traoré, Goita, and Chani have all framed themselves as transitional figures, ushering in a new era, not just for the countries, but for the region. But is it the solution Africa has been missing? That's the real question. Because while the rhetoric is bold and the public support is real, there are serious concerns. No clear timeline for elections in any of the AES countries. Media crackdowns and opposition repression in some cases. Still, a heavy reliance on foreign military contractors like Wagner. Consolidation of executive power with minimal checks.
You've said, Professor, that countries with recent coups are at risk of falling into the coup trap. Is it possible to assess the criteria and say which country might be vulnerable in the future?
It is very difficult. I'm working with some scholars in the statistics and machine learning department here at CMU to try to develop ColpusCast, a new forecasting model, to do exactly what you're asking. Unfortunately, it's still a little premature. We're not quite ready to launch. However, having said that, it is logical to assume that countries that look like those that have had coups recently in terms of structural factors should be those that are most at risk. My brilliant colleague, Hallie Bartos, for example, thinks that Paul Biya in Cameroon should be quite worried. Like Ali Bongo and his father, he's a longtime dictator and a country that's quite dependent on France. And you can imagine that he'll be taking steps to try to secure his rule moving forward.
So the risk here is clear, that in the name of sovereignty and security, authoritarianism could quietly harden. AES may claim to be building something new, but without strong institutions, civic space, and clear accountability, it could end up repeating the same cycle, but under a different flag. But still, it represents something important, a bold demand for African ownership over politics, resources, and future. And whether or not AES gets it right, it's already forcing the continent to confront a bigger question. What would a system look like if Africa actually built it for itself? Can Africa build something better? Not just different, but truly better. Because right now the continent is at a crossroads. On one side, we have democratic systems that too often fail to deliver. On the other, we have military regimes claiming to offer order, but with unclear roadmaps. But maybe, just maybe, there's a third path, and that's homegrown governance, not imported models. Africa doesn't need to copy anyone else's system. Across the continent, there are indigenous traditions of consensus, council, and community leadership systems that center the people long before colonial rule. So imagine blending those roots with modern tools elected leadership, digital accountability, independent media, participatory budgeting, public transparency at every level. Africa doesn't lack ideas. It's been forced to choose between broken options. Now is the time to create new ones. And we need stronger institutions because institutions matter more than individuals. Strong leaders may rise, but without strong institutions, it's just a matter of time before everything collapses again. What Africa needs now is courts that can be bought, electoral commissions that can't be bullied, and civic spaces that can't be shut down. Whether under a soldier or a civilian, power has to be checked, or it'll be abused, as history has shown us. We also need a reawakened citizenry. No model will work unless the people are engaged. And maybe that's the silver lining of this moment. People are paying attention. They're asking questions. They're taking to the streets. They're debating sovereignty, legitimacy, and justice in ways that were once off limits. This is a moment of reckoning, yes, but also a moment of reimagining. So maybe this isn't the death of democracy in Africa. Maybe it's the beginning of something deeper, more rooted, more real. Because a continent doesn't just need a system that looks democratic. It just needs a system that functions. And the future belongs to those willing to build it intentionally, courageously, and together. So where do we go from here, my people? The coups are a symptom. The broken systems, the hollow democracies, the foreign entanglements, those are the disease. And the truth is, there's no easy fix. But here's what we know. The people are awake, wide awake. They're demanding more, not just from politicians, but from the entire structure of governance itself. And that might just be the start of something powerful. So now I turn it over to you. What do you think? Are we witnessing a dangerous rollback of democracy or the beginning of a deeper political awakening on the continent? Can military regimes deliver what elected governments couldn't? And most importantly, what kind of governance do you believe Africa deserves? Let me know in the comments. You know I'm in there with you, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And if this episode sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your group chats, hit subscribe, tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Drop a super thanks if you believe in the work we're doing here. And hey, consider joining our membership community to go even deeper with us. Because here at Panda Genius TV, we're building something bigger than a show. We're building a global home for truth-telling, power analysis, and visionary conversations about the future. All right, that's it for today's show. This was a heavy one, but a necessary one. Thanks for staying with me. I'm Sandra Babu-Boateng. This is The Breakdown. And until next time, take care. Hey, you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.